The air is thick with the stench of burnt resin and iron. Metal walls groan under the weight of centuries, and distant clanks echo like the heartbeat of a world forgotten by the Emperor himself. Prisoners huddle in shadows, their eyes hollow, bodies gaunt from rationed promethium and synthetic protein. Outside, the Imperium's indifference is absolute. Inside, the machinery of punishment is relentless, precise, and merciless. Here, in the bowels of an off-world penal hive, survival is not a right. It is a struggle measured in moments, in the sharp edge of obedience, in the silent toll of despair. Every step could trigger a mechanized trap. Every whisper could draw the attention of a servitor or an enforcer. Humanity is stripped down to its barest instincts. And even loyalty to the Emperor becomes a weapon against you. If you want to journey into the depths of Warhammer 40K's darkest incarceration, witness the raw edge of survival, and understand what it truly means to live or die under the Imperium's relentless gaze, stay with me. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so this story reaches those who dare to look beyond the golden facade of Terra. The transport rumble of the convoys tore across the jagged cliffs of the penal world, each vehicle straining under the weight of bodies pressed into their metal confines. The prisoners had been collected from countless hives, manufactorums, and frontier outposts, yet here, in this grim exile, they were indistinguishable. Faces gaunt, eyes hollowed by fear and fatigue, and hands chained to the cold, unyielding bulkhead of the transports. The air inside was thick, mingling the acrid tang of sweat with the faint metallic stench of blood and oil from previous occupants. Few dared speak, and those who did whispered only in fragmented phrases, careful not to draw the attention of the armored enforcers stationed at each door of the convoy. Outside, the sky was an iron dome, streaked with ash and the distant trails of promethium flares. The horizon trembled under the shadow of the prison gates, immense constructs of rusted adamantium etched with the faded imperial aquila and reinforced with layers of substructural ceramite. Each hinge groaned like a living thing, warning of the millennia it had endured and perhaps the countless screams that had fallen silent beneath its weight. As the convoy came to a grinding halt, a hush spread among the prisoners. The enforcers, skeletal in power armor scarred with ritualistic etchings, moved with deliberate precision, their servo-assisted limbs whirring in the oppressive stillness. They carried the cold authority of the Imperium itself, each step a reminder that mercy did not exist within these walls. When the transport doors were pried open, a blast of frozen air struck the prisoners like the bite of a predator's maw. The ground beneath them was uneven, stained with rust and the remnants of failed laborers, and the sharp scent of burning resin and industrial chemicals clawed at the senses. The first step into the penal complex felt like crossing into another dimension, a liminal space where hope was stripped away before the body could even settle. Enforcers barked orders in clipped mechanical tones, and prisoners shuffled forward, chains clinking in a discordant chorus. Some stumbled, weak from transport deprivation. Others froze entirely, staring at the walls that seemed to swallow them whole. The gates, now looming above, were only the first of many barriers. Beyond them stretched courtyards of blackened stone and scorched metal, punctuated with watchtowers that bristled with weapon emplacements and auto-sentinels. Servitors with eyeless visors and hydraulic arms trundled among the prisoners, checking their ident chips and marking those deemed weak, sickly, or rebellious. Every sound, every movement was measured against the grid of control that dominated this place. Even the sky seemed to weigh down upon them, muted by the choking dust and the faint hum of distant machinery. Rumors spread quietly among the prisoners, tales of labor gangs swallowed by toxic fumes, of executions that could last days, of solitary cells where sanity itself was torn apart. None of these stories could have prepared them for the reality pressing in on every side, the smell of despair that clung to the walls, the ceaseless clatter of chains across stone, and the ever-present gaze of those who saw prisoners not as humans, but as raw material to be broken and repurposed. The first meal, if it could be called that, was a ration of thick protein paste, tasteless and cold, served by a servitor with a single unblinking ocular. It was sustenance, nothing more, and even that was measured to exact caloric minimums. Among the prisoners, whispers tried to weave themselves into courage. "The Emperor watches," some murmured, a mantra against the oppressive weight of the gates. Others, hardened by countless transfers and trials, offered only a grim silence, knowing that any flicker of hope was a target in itself. And yet even here, in this crucible of despair, there was a strange clarity. Survival demanded observation, adaptation, and the painful discipline to discard weakness before it discarded you. Every glance at the towering gates, every shiver of the wind against rusted metal, reinforced the simple truth: nothing within these walls would grant mercy, and only those who could endure the full machinery of the Imperium might live to see another day. Chains rattled again, and the convoy doors groaned shut, sealing behind the last group of arrivals. The gates loomed, silent and eternal, a monument to suffering, and beyond them, the prison breathed, a living organism of iron, ceramite, and promethium flame, indifferent to the humanity pressed against its thresholds. For those first moments, standing under its oppressive shadow, every prisoner understood a bitter truth: the world they had known had ended, and the gates of despair had no promise of return. The prisoners were marched deeper into the complex, each step echoing against walls blackened by centuries of smoke and neglect. The corridors twisted like the insides of a monstrous machine, their geometry designed as much to confuse as to confine. Overhead, grated catwalks crisscrossed in a lattice of shadows, servitors gliding silently above with their optic sensors, scanning, recording, judging. The faint hum of power conduits vibrated through the floors, a constant, low-frequency reminder that the prison itself was alive, hungry for obedience, or for the failure that would justify its next cycle of punishment. Occasionally, a prisoner would stumble or falter, and the enforcer's response was immediate and brutal. A hydraulic fist slammed into a chest, sending a body sprawling across the cold, unyielding floor. Others were dragged to the side, their screams muted by resonant dampeners, and in moments like these, the rest learned quickly that weakness had a price. Chains scraped along stone, boots clanged in precise rhythms, and the corridors seemed to close in, pressing the prisoners into themselves. Every breath tasted of dust and fear. Every blink illuminated the oppressive surveillance around them. Rooms opened into vast labor chambers where the real work and real suffering began. Here prisoners were assigned to the endless processing of raw ore, the refining of promethium, the assembly of crude weaponry, or the maintenance of machinery whose purpose was known only to higher authorities. The work was unrelenting, mechanical, and designed not to exhaust the body alone, but the spirit. The overseers watched from elevated platforms, their presence a constant reminder that every failure, every faltering limb, could lead to immediate and visible punishment. In these chambers, sound itself became a weapon. The pounding of hammers, the hiss of vented steam, the abrupt shriek of alarms when mistakes were made. Yet even in the deepest despair, small signs of life persisted. Prisoners huddled in corners, sharing whispered fragments of information. Which servitors were reliable? Which corridors allowed brief moments of privacy? And where scraps could be traded for slightly more tolerable rations. It was a fragile web of survival, dependent on secrecy, trust, and sometimes the willingness to betray another for one more day of existence. These alliances were rarely permanent, and the constant tension between hope and betrayal became another layer of the prison's oppression, teaching every inmate that nothing could be assumed, and everything had a cost. The psychological strain became palpable after days spent in these halls. Sleep was a fleeting luxury, granted only in brief intervals before the unceasing demands of labor resumed. Dreams, when they came, were haunted by the grinding machinery, by the echoing voices of overseers, by the metallic smell of the very walls themselves. Some prisoners began speaking to shadows, or arguing with their own reflections in puddles of oily water, their sanity fraying under the relentless pressure. Even the strongest of wills bent under the weight of monotony, exhaustion, and constant observation. As the prisoners were funneled toward their designated cells, The scale of the facility became terrifyingly clear. Endless tiers of habitation modules, stacked one atop another like the ribs of some massive creature, stretched far beyond the reach of the eye. Each cell was sparse, a cold metal slab for a bed, a waste channel that never fully emptied, and the unyielding walls that seemed to absorb any sound, any plea, any prayer. Light came from harsh, flickering lumens, casting long shadows that shifted unnaturally with the movement of the prisoners, the enforcers, and the unseen machinery above. The impression was not merely of confinement, but of being consumed by the prison itself, a machine designed to grind both body and mind. For the new arrivals, the final moments before the gates sealed were the days inside the penal complex were a continuum of pain and repetition, a cycle measured not by hours but by labor, hunger, and the quiet terror of observation. Dawn was meaningless beneath the iron skies. Light came instead from harsh, flickering lumens that illuminated endless corridors, machinery, and labor halls. Prisoners rose from their cold slabs, not refreshed but merely capable of moving, their muscles stiff, their joints cracking under the weight of exhaustion. The air was thick with the scent of promethium, burnt resin, and the lingering tang of fear. Every inhale reminded them that survival was no longer a matter of skill, strength, or cunning. It was a calculation, a negotiation with the machinery of oppression surrounding them. Work began immediately, often without warning, the enforcers dictating movements through sharp, clipped commands that left no room for hesitation. Labor ranged from the mundane to the punishing. Hauling ore from the depths of the prison mines, feeding crude assembly lines, scrubbing the metallic floors where toxic residues pooled. Each task was monitored, every misstep punished with blunt force, electric shock, or the dreaded isolation cells where light and sound themselves were withheld. Even the strongest prisoners learned quickly that hesitation was deadly. Instinct became the currency of survival, sharpened not by skill but by fear. Food, when it arrived, was a matter of mechanics rather than sustenance. Protein paste, thick and tasteless, barely sustained life, measured with meticulous precision. Water was rationed, cold and metallic from rusted conduits, leaving a lingering aftertaste that reminded prisoners of their bodily fragility. Some traded scraps for favors, a whispered kindness here, a small act of defiance there, each exchange fraught with risk. Bonds formed and dissolved with brutal speed. The prison rewarded pragmatism and punished sentimentality. Even camaraderie became a weapon, a fragile illusion easily shattered by the caprice of overseers or the greed of those desperate to survive. Time was a blurred concept, measured in the rhythm of servitors' movements, the grinding of machinery, and the intermittent shouts of enforcers. Sleep was scarce and shallow, taken in stolen intervals while the rest of the compound operated without pause. Dreams, when they surfaced, were haunted by the prison itself. Corridors stretching impossibly, chains wrapping endlessly around limbs, eyes of overseers lurking in every shadow. Sanity became a fragile shield, constantly tested by the relentless physical and psychological toll. Some prisoners whispered prayers to the emperor. Others muttered to themselves, trying to anchor identity to memory, belief, or the faint glimmer of hope that still lingered in the darkest corners of the mind. Punishments were as varied as they were cruel. A simple error could mean the loss of rations for days, an extended shift under excruciating labor, or a direct confrontation with the enforcer's power armor-clad brutality. Isolation cells were particularly feared. Within, the absence of sound and light seemed to gnaw at the edges of the mind. Rumors suggested some prisoners were driven entirely mad, reduced to echoing the commands of their tormentors or speaking only to the shadows. And yet, the system was precise. It punished without cruelty for cruelty's sake. Its goal was control, absolute and complete, refining obedience from despair and teaching compliance with every stroke, shove, and metallic clang. In the corners of this relentless existence, alliances, however temporary, began to form. Prisoners who could read behavior, understand unspoken cues, and anticipate the machinery of oppression became minor authorities among themselves. Secrets were traded cautiously, whispers of ration hacks, timing shifts in the labor lines, or moments when the enforcer's attention faltered. These networks were dangerous, for betrayal could come from the most trusted ally, yet they were necessary. Human connection, however tenuous, was the only relief from the grinding monotony and unyielding observation that defined every waking hour. Amid the labor and constant surveillance, rumors persisted of prisoners who had vanished, taken to unknown chambers, or simply erased from the manifest. Others spoke quietly of transfer to even harsher facilities, or of experimental punishments devised by overseers who treated human endurance as a metric to be tested. These stories circulated in hushed tones as both warning and grim entertainment, sharpening the prisoner's awareness that nothing was permanent, nothing predictable, and no act of courage could guarantee survival. Every moment required vigilance. Every decision measured against the machinery of the Imperium and the hidden hierarchies among those condemned to its bowels. Even as exhaustion drained the body and fear gnawed at the mind, the prisoners adapted. They learned which tasks to accept silently, how to avoid the gaze of the overseers when possible, and how to endure punishment without drawing attention. Survival was no longer a matter of hope. It was a series of calculated movements, an unending negotiation with pain, authority, and the raw mechanics of life under absolute control. And in that delicate equilibrium, a subtle, unspoken resilience emerged, the human instinct to endure, to persist, even when the world itself seemed designed to erase them entirely. Days bled into nights, and nights into more days, yet the prison never ceased its unrelenting rhythm. Time was not measured by calendars or the rise and fall of suns. It was the pulse of the factory floors, the hiss of vented steam, and the metallic heartbeat of servitors marching endlessly along their programmed paths. Prisoners quickly learned that existence itself was subordinate to the mechanisms around them. Every action had consequence, every misstep a reminder that the Imperium's machine required compliance above all else. Even thought could be punished if it manifested in hesitation, defiance, or subtle resistance. The labor halls were vast, cavernous spaces filled with machinery that seemed alive, belching smoke, trembling with hydraulic strain, and screaming when abused. Prisoners were mere cogs within this monstrous engine, their bodies guided, coerced, and sometimes shattered to keep the facility functioning. Broken bones were treated with minimal medical intervention. Infections were counted as attrition. Some prisoners adapted by moving like shadows, conserving energy where possible, learning the idiosyncrasies of equipment to avoid injury. Others succumbed, their screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the machinery, their absence noted only when their stations remained empty. Punishment was not always immediate, but it was inevitable. Overseers, towering in power armor and adorned with the ritual scars of countless campaigns, moved silently among the prisoners, eyes hidden behind glowing visors that saw everything. A dropped tool, a misaligned crate, a misstep in a formation, all could trigger swift correction. The methods varied: crushing blows, searing electric shocks, or confinement in cells that denied sound, light, and time itself. Yet the greatest terror lay not in physical suffering, but in the uncertainty of when or how punishment would strike. Prisoners learned to anticipate, to submit, to become almost invisible in mind and body. Amidst this calculated cruelty, human resilience found strange outlets. Some prisoners developed routines, memorizing the rhythm of machinery, synchronizing steps with the subtle hum of power conduits to reduce mistakes. Others created silent systems of communication, subtle gestures and glances that conveyed warnings or small pieces of knowledge. Even in this environment of oppression, small victories were possible. A ration shared, a moment spared from labor, a whispered joke that survived only in the shadows. These small acts carried immense weight, fueling a fragile sense of agency in a world designed to extinguish it. Hunger and thirst remained relentless punishments in themselves. Protein paste, barely palatable, became a constant reminder of the body's fragility, while water, often laced with metallic taste and chemical residue, served only to prolong survival without comfort. Prisoners rationed their intake, trading scraps or favors to eke out small advantages, learning the intricate social economy that existed even among those crushed by despair. Every negotiation, every alliance, carried the risk of betrayal. Trust was rare, and even that which existed was fragile, suspended precariously above the ever-present machinery of punishment. Psychological erosion became as lethal as physical exhaustion. Sleep was fitful and shallow, often punctuated by nightmares that blurred memory with the machinery of the prison. The hum of hydraulic presses, the clanging of chains, and the monotone commands of overseers invaded dreams, leaving prisoners to wake before the body had rested, already anticipating the next cycle of labor and scrutiny. Those who resisted the grinding monotony were quickly identified, their defiance crushed methodically until compliance became instinctive, almost unconscious. Resistance was not impossible, but it required courage tempered by precision, a dangerous balance few could maintain. Despite this, the prison's denizens clung to whatever semblance of humanity they could preserve. They whispered prayers to the emperor, muttered to themselves about lives left behind, and remembered the faces of loved ones in fleeting, stolen moments. These memories, fragile as they were, became survival tools, anchors to identity in a world determined to strip them bare. For some, these anchors were the difference between endurance and surrender, the faintest spark in an environment designed to extinguish all light. And yet, for all the adaptation and resilience, the system's cruelty remained absolute. As weeks bled into months, the repetitive cruelty of the penal complex became a rhythm prisoners could anticipate, though anticipation offered no comfort. Each day was a carefully choreographed series of movements, dictated by overseers and enforced by machinery, chains, and the ever-watchful servitors. The prisoners learned to anticipate the patterns of punishment as much as the patterns of labor. When inspections would occur, which enforcers were lenient or merciless, where hidden hazards might lurk. Survival was not chance. It was an unending study in adaptation and observation. Some prisoners began to notice subtler horrors embedded in the system, ones that escaped the overt brutality of labor halls and punishment cells. Machines operated not only to enforce work, but to observe, measure, and record the faintest anomalies in human behavior. Hydraulic presses monitored rhythm and posture. Servitors recorded hesitation in microseconds. Overseers noted the smallest deviation from protocol. The prison was not a mere building. It was a consciousness in metal and ceramite, a machine designed to refine compliance from every human flaw. The psychological strain deepened as isolation became a weapon wielded even within groups. Prisoners were constantly aware that alliances were temporary, fragile as filaments stretched over a chasm of fear. A moment of trust could mean betrayal, and even fleeting kindness carried the risk of exposure to enforcers' scrutiny. Conversations were whispered in shadows, coded gestures became a lifeline, and silence was often safer than speech. Yet in this delicate social dance, small victories, an exchanged scrap of food, a diverted overseer's attention, a shared moment of defiance became lifelines, ephemeral reminders that humanity persisted even under relentless oppression. The body itself became a site of constant negotiation. Labor forced muscles and bones to their limits, rations were insufficient for true strength, and exhaustion blurred the line between living and enduring. Injuries were common, and the prison provided only the most minimal treatment, sometimes nothing at all, allowing minor wounds to fester into debilitating infections. Some prisoners learned to compensate by observing patterns in machinery and labor, moving in ways that reduced physical strain. Others failed, their bodies breaking under the weight of expectation, their absence noted only as a gap in the ranks. Fear was omnipresent, but it was a fear that grew nuanced and personal over time. It was not just the pain of punishment or the threat of death that dominated consciousness, but the subtle erosion of self. Every enforced task, every order followed, every rationed meal was a reminder that autonomy was no longer possible. Identity became measured by compliance. Humanity itself was at risk of being reduced to a collection of actions designed to satisfy the relentless demands of the system. Yet, paradoxically, it was precisely in these moments of internal erosion that resilience emerged. Prisoners found new ways to preserve fragments of self, a song hummed under breath, a memory of home, or a silent prayer to the emperor. These small acts became acts of defiance, gestures that reminded the mind that it was still alive, still capable of hope, even if that hope was fragile and fleeting. Rumors persisted of prisoners who had resisted too boldly, who had tested the boundaries of the complex only to be erased from existence. Some said they were taken to hidden chambers where the body was studied, where compliance was forcibly instilled through unknown methods, or where they were fed to experiments that blurred the line between humanity and machine. Other stories spoke of those who, against all odds, survived transfers to harsher facilities, returning with haunted eyes and whispered knowledge of unimaginable suffering. These tales circulated quietly, both as warnings and grim curiosities, sharpening the prisoner's sense that survival required not courage alone, but cunning, vigilance, and the constant suppression of emotional impulses. Even as the oppressive rhythm persisted, pockets of humanity persisted too. Prisoners learned to read each other, to anticipate moods and shifts in authority, to share survival strategies without drawing attention. The smallest acts, a shared ration, a concealed tool, a whispered warning, carried profound significance. These were the threads that held fragments of community together in a place designed to obliterate it. In this interplay of observation, endurance, and cautious connection, prisoners began to cultivate the skills necessary to exist not merely as bodies in labor, but as conscious minds still capable of choice, even if every choice was measured, calculated, and fraught with risk. By the end of each cycle, as prisoners returned to their cells, their bodies battered and their minds strained. The reality of existence within the penal complex was undeniable. Survival was possible, but it required a delicate balance between endurance and cunning, between submission and quiet defiance. The grind of existence was relentless, yet it forged a perverse clarity in those who endured, a knowledge that the machinery of oppression, no matter how vast and unyielding, could be navigated, not through strength alone, but through observation, strategy, and an unbroken will to persist. Within the depths of the penal complex, where the clang of chains and the hiss of machinery formed an oppressive symphony, subtle networks began to emerge, shadows within shadows, whispers beneath the roar of labor. Prisoners learned that survival demanded more than endurance. It required perception, intuition, and above all, secrecy. Every glance could carry meaning, every pause in the rhythm of labor could be a signal. In a place designed to reduce humans to instruments of production, these clandestine communications became lifelines. The corridors, seemingly uniform and oppressive, offered hidden pockets where one could observe without being observed. Narrow ventilation shafts, disused maintenance alcoves, and shadowed corners became refuges where whispered words and exchanged items could pass unnoticed. Prisoners who understood these hidden spaces quickly gained influence, not power sanctioned by the overseers, but the soft authority of knowledge. They became navigators of a secret world that existed parallel to the grinding labor and relentless punishment of the complex. Trust was the rarest commodity. It was given sparingly, often only to those whose survival instincts mirrored one's own, and was revoked the moment it became a liability. Betrayal was commonplace, but so too was loyalty, though it existed in fleeting conditional forms. Prisoners learned to read subtle cues, a glance, a hesitation, the way chains rattled underfoot. Each signal could mean cooperation or treachery, survival or doom, and the cost of misjudgment was absolute, enforced by enforcers who saw only compliance and weakness, and who punished deviation without hesitation. Amid the shadowed networks, stories circulated like sparks in the darkness. Tales of escape attempts, secret caches of rationed protein, and whispered knowledge of machinery malfunctions became currency. Even the smallest fragments of information could tip the balance between survival and death. Rumors of hidden passages and abandoned labor halls were treated with equal parts hope and skepticism. Some led to discovery, others to death. In this delicate dance of information, prisoners learned that knowledge itself was a weapon, often more potent than brute strength. The overseers remained an ever-present threat, their power absolute and their intentions inscrutable. Every movement of prisoners was catalogued, every pause analyzed. Servitors with ocular sensors recorded behavior, their data feeding into invisible systems of evaluation. Any misalignment between instinct and expectation invited scrutiny, correction, or worse. Yet even amidst this omnipresent observation, prisoners found ways to exploit patterns. Subtle timing, careful mimicry of expected behavior, and the cultivation of predictable routines allowed fleeting freedom to maneuver within the rigid structures of oppression. In these conditions, human ingenuity became a tool of survival. Prisoners devised hidden signals, concealed minor tools, and even orchestrated brief diversions to shield one another from punishment. Each act carried enormous risk, for exposure meant immediate retribution, often physical, sometimes psychological. Yet necessity outweighed caution, and the faint flickering sense of control over one's immediate environment became a lifeline. In these moments, even the most broken spirits discovered fragments of resilience, reminders that the mind could remain free, even if the body was enslaved. Dark corners of the prison also harbored whispers of forbidden knowledge, rumors of experiments, of prisoners transformed into something less than human, or of those who had been absorbed by the machinery itself. Such tales were rarely spoken aloud, yet they infused the hidden networks with tension and fear. The line between fact and fabrication blurred, as it often did in a place designed to crush certainty. Still, these shadows of rumor-shaped behavior instilled caution and reinforced the understanding that information, like life itself, was dangerous yet indispensable. Among the prisoners, alliances took on layered complexity. Cooperation was often temporary, dependent on circumstance and immediate need. Survival required the ability to calculate, to weigh risk and reward, to anticipate betrayal as much as to offer loyalty. Even small victories, a protected ration, a momentary reprieve from labor, the successful concealment of a whispered warning, carried tremendous significance. These were the moments that allowed prisoners to endure the otherwise suffocating monotony and brutality of the complex, affirming that agency, how. Within the shadowed corridors of the penal complex, whispers carried weight greater than chains or iron bars. Prisoners began to understand that knowledge was both shield and weapon, and that secrecy was a form of survival. A glance exchanged at the right moment, a subtle shift in posture, a carefully timed cough could convey urgent information without alerting the overseers. In a place where overt communication could mean punishment or death, these silent signals became the lifeblood of prisoner networks. Rumors of hidden caches, abandoned workstations, and structural weaknesses circulated in hushed tones. Some prisoners claimed to know which maintenance corridors led past watchtowers or where servitors' patrols lagged. Others whispered of distant blocks rumored to contain tools or rations illicitly stored, places long forgotten by the enforcers but not by those desperate enough to search. Every rumor carried risk. A failed attempt to access these secrets could result in immediate punishment. Yet the potential reward outweighed fear, for in the harsh calculus of prison life, even a single extra ration or a moment of temporary freedom could make the difference between endurance and collapse. Trust, however, remained a fragile currency. Alliances formed cautiously and dissolved just as swiftly. A shared secret could create temporary bonds, but the specter of betrayal hovered over every interaction. Prisoners learned to read micro-expressions, to detect the subtle flicker of hesitation in another's eyes, the barely perceptible tension in a shoulder or hand. Misreading even the smallest signal could lead to a betrayal that was not merely humiliating, but lethal. Paranoia became instinct, a necessary adaptation to survive among those who were both companions and threats. Within these networks, small hierarchies emerged. Prisoners who displayed cunning, resourcefulness, or a knack for reading others became de facto leaders, guiding small groups through the complexities of daily survival. They organized minor trades of food or tools, coordinated shifts to avoid enforcer scrutiny, and shared intelligence about machinery and patrol patterns. Power, however, was never absolute. Every act of authority carried danger, for enforcers would not hesitate to crush any perceived challenge. These hierarchies were fragile, sustained only by necessity and mutual dependence, constantly threatened by betrayal and fear. Even the overseers, for all their technological advantage, could be manipulated in subtle ways. Observant prisoners noted patterns in surveillance, timing errors in servitor patrols, and the idiosyncrasies of enforcer behavior. A misaligned step, a feigned error, or a diverted glance could create fleeting opportunities for concealment or minor acts of defiance. These acts were not heroic, they were pragmatic, calculated, and often invisible. But they offered prisoners a sense of agency in a world designed to suppress it. In the mechanics of survival, the smallest advantage could mean life. The psychological pressure of life in the shadows intensified over time. Prisoners existed in a constant state of vigilance, their minds trained to detect anomalies, assess risk, and anticipate betrayal. Sleep remained scarce, punctuated by nightmares that blended reality with machinery and authority, leaving the mind raw and the body exhausted. Yet even in this relentless cycle, moments of connection persisted. A whispered joke, a shared ration, or the careful preservation of an unspoken pact. These small gestures became acts of rebellion, assertions of humanity within a system built to erase it. Rumors of those who had vanished, or of those who had resisted too boldly, permeated the hidden networks. Some said prisoners were taken to experimental cells, altered into something inhuman, or consumed entirely by the machinery of the prison. Others claimed that distant overseers, rumored to be inquisitors in disguise, watched for signs of insurrection, ensuring that even clandestine alliances could not escape ultimate scrutiny. These stories, whether true or not, shaped behavior and sharpened instincts. Knowledge, after all, carried both power and risk. It could save a life or mark one for destruction. As weeks passed, prisoners grew adept at balancing observation, caution, and strategy. They learned which shadows were safe, which signals could be trusted, and which alliances were likely to fracture. Even amidst the oppressive weight of the prison, they carved out spaces of relative autonomy, small sanctuaries where identity could persist, however precariously. These were not acts of defiance in the traditional sense. They did not challenge the enforcer's authority, but they represented a subtle resistance to total dehumanization, a reaffirmation that even in the darkest corners, the human mind could remain free. By the end of this cycle, it became clear survival in the penal complex required more than physical endurance. It demanded perception, calculation, and the courage to navigate networks of secrecy where trust was fleeting and betrayal was inevitable. Shadows became shields, rumors became maps, and secrets became the means by which prisoners could assert agency against a system designed to erase it. In this hidden world, knowledge was life itself, and the faintest glimmer of understanding could carry a soul through days and nights that sought to extinguish it entirely. Even within the oppressive confines of the penal complex, the prisoners were never fully isolated from the wider imperium. Rumors drifted through the labyrinthine corridors like smoke, whispered from one inmate to another, carried through hacked data slates or murmured across labor halls. Some spoke of distant hives, utterly consumed by the machinery of industry or devastation. Entire worlds reduced to ash under imperial mandate or alien incursion. Others whispered of far-off inquisitorial oversight, shadowed figures who weighed souls as much as compliance, wielding the power to send a single prisoner to obscurity, or worse. These stories, factual or imagined, painted a picture of a universe both vast and indifferent, reminding the prisoners that their suffering was part of a larger, incomprehensible machine. The scope of the Imperium was overwhelming, even from within the prison. Prisoners spoke of the Emperor's distant vigilance, the Astronomican's psychic glow guiding vessels across the void, and the endless fleets that defended or ravaged countless star systems. Some claimed that off-world news made its way into the prison through hidden transmissions or corrupted Vox channels, offering glimpses of war, alien conquest, and civil unrest in the reaches of space. These fragments, even when distorted or partially fabricated, carried the weight of possibility. The knowledge that life beyond the prison's walls was untouchable, and perhaps unknowable, yet still existed. In the shadows, prisoners speculated on the existence of higher powers and secret overseers. Whispers suggested inquisitors prowled the complex in disguise, evaluating those whose resilience or ingenuity might make them threats or valuable tools. Others spoke of distant Adeptus Mechanicus laboratories, where prisoners were selected for experiments that blurred the line between flesh and machine, their suffering a measure of the Imperium's obsession with efficiency and control. Even the faintest hints of these possibilities inspired both fear and careful planning, as inmates weighed every decision against the unseen eyes of authorities who operated beyond the walls. Beyond human oversight, alien incursions and external threats became a common topic in whispered narratives. Stories of orcs decimating entire planets, tyrannid swarms consuming every living thing, and Necron tomb worlds awakening from slumber seeped into the prison's consciousness, often distorted and embellished. Prisoners clung to these rumors as a form of orientation, a way to contextualize their suffering in a universe so vast and hostile that even the penal complex seemed, in comparison, a contained and almost predictable environment. The stories were terrifying, yet they carried a grim comfort. Outside the gates, horrors existed too, suggesting that their torment, while intense, was a microcosm of a far larger cosmos of suffering. Even communications with the outside world were mediated by layers of manipulation and control. Data slates occasionally transmitted fragments of news, often sanitized or deliberately corrupted, hinting at rebellions crushed, Adeptus Astartes campaigns won or lost, and distant systems ravaged by war or plague. Prisoners interpreted these fragments with caution, extracting meaning from shadows and gaps. Each snippet of knowledge was a tool, a rumor, or a warning, sharpening instincts and heightening awareness of the broader Imperium while underscoring the futility of hope for deliverance. Amidst these echoes, prisoners began to form more sophisticated networks. Information became currency, and subtle observation of machines, overseers, and fellow inmates was critical. Some prisoners developed rudimentary means to transmit messages through labor halls, using the rhythm of machinery or patterns of movement as code. Others leveraged small acts of cunning, exploiting brief lapses in surveillance to smuggle food, tools, or information. These acts were never without risk, yet they allowed inmates to maintain a fragile sense of agency and connection to a universe larger than the walls enclosing them. In these moments, the distinction between survival and understanding blurred. The prisoners realized that existence within the penal complex was not merely a test of endurance, but a training ground for perception, strategy, and resilience. By interpreting whispers, rumors, and subtle environmental cues, they could anticipate danger, exploit opportunity, and preserve fragments of identity, even in a universe dominated by the Imperium's M. As prisoners navigated the interplay between shadows and whispers, the distant universe loomed ever larger in their consciousness. Even within the prison's iron walls, the scope of the Imperium was impossible to ignore. Tales of battles waged across planets, fleets swallowed by warp storms, and entire star systems consumed by tyrannid swarms became more than stories. They were instruments of orientation, markers of scale in a life otherwise reduced to repetitive labor and fear. Prisoners who internalized these narratives learned to think beyond the immediate oppression, finding a measure of perspective that, however fragile, bolstered endurance. In the labor halls, whispers often carried subtle warnings. A fragment of information about a distant battle might signal impending transfers or new experimental punishments, while a rumor of alien activity on a neighboring system became a metaphorical reminder of the fragility of life. These echoes were interpreted, cataloged, and shared cautiously, forming a layer of strategic thinking that extended beyond mere survival. Knowledge of the wider Imperium, even in partial or distorted form, became a currency of power within the prisoner networks. offering insight that could mean the difference between life and death. Some prisoners became adept at leveraging these whispers to influence their peers. By selectively sharing information, they could manipulate perception, form temporary hierarchies, or encourage compliance and caution. A carefully told tale of an Astartes purge, an inquisitor's inspection, or a rumored alien incursion could shift behavior, motivate endurance, or create calculated fear. These subtle acts of control required observation, timing, and an understanding of both human nature and the machinery of oppression. In the penal complex, influence was rarely overt, but it was vital, offering a glimpse of agency where none seemed possible. The psychological impact of these echoes was profound. Prisoners realized that the universe beyond the walls was vast, dangerous, and indifferent, yet alive in ways the prison itself could never replicate. The Imperium's immensity rendered the prisoners' suffering both minuscule and significant. Minuscule in comparison to cosmic-scale threats, but significant in the demonstration of human resilience. For those who could interpret the whispers wisely, these distant horrors became training grounds for foresight and endurance. They learned to anticipate threats, prepare for shifts in authority, and preserve their minds even as their bodies were exploited. Even within the prison, small acts of defiance and adaptation took on new meaning in the context of the wider universe. A prisoner who altered a labor sequence to reduce injury, a hidden ration cache preserved for an ally, or a whispered warning about an enforcer's unpredictable behavior became miniature revolutions against the system. These acts were invisible to the overseers but vital to the prisoner's survival, reinforcing the understanding that influence and power existed in subtlety, observation, and the careful exploitation of opportunity. Rumors of alien interference, though often exaggerated, also carried lessons. Stories of orc raiders cutting through industrial worlds, tyrannid tendrils consuming entire settlements, or Necron forces awakening from tomb worlds suggested a universe in which human suffering was one small element in a vast tableau of violence. Prisoners interpreted these tales strategically. An orc invasion might mean a temporary distraction from routine, a tyrannid advance might inspire caution, and a Necron awakening might underscore the impermanence of life itself. Even fear became a tool, shaping behavior and guiding the calculations necessary for endurance. As the prisoners adapted to the pressures of both internal oppression and the imagined threats beyond the walls, a subtle evolution occurred. Survival became not merely a function of physical strength or obedience, but of awareness and foresight. Those who could read whispers, interpret rumors, and anticipate shifts in both human and external forces gained an edge. The penal complex, for all its brutality, inadvertently trained them to perceive patterns, weigh consequences, and act decisively, skills that might one day be necessary beyond the gates. Yet the echoes of the universe remained tantalizingly distant. The sky beyond the iron walls was visible only through narrow observation ports, streaked with ash and muted by atmospheric pollution, a constant reminder of the freedom denied to those within. The Imperium's vastness was understood only indirectly through stories, rumor, and speculation. And in this understanding, prisoners found both despair and resilience. Despair in the enormity of the forces beyond their control, resilience in the knowledge that awareness, adaptation, and cunning could provide some measure of survival, even in a world designed to erase identity and will. In this tension between oppression and perspective, the prisoners carved out a fragile equilibrium. The wider universe, its dangers, mysteries, and powers, was both a source of fear and a framework for strategy. It offered context to their suffering, lessons in observation, and a measure of hope, however faint. In understanding the echoes beyond the walls, the prisoners glimpsed the possibility of agency, even if only in small, imperceptible increments, and the faint realization that survival required both endurance and intelligence. Shadow and subtlety, in equal measure, the prison's machinery never slept. Even as prisoners slumped against cold walls, muscles trembling from labor and hunger, the echoes of its operation persisted, a constant metallic heartbeat that underscored the fragility of life within its walls. Those who had endured weeks, months, even years learned that survival demanded more than obedience. It required perception, sharpened to an almost painful acuity, a relentless awareness of both human and mechanical predators, and a capacity to navigate terror without succumbing entirely to it. Here, the edge of oblivion was not a distant threat. It was the air itself, the very ground, the ever-present shadow of the overseers. The boundaries between reality and rumor blurred at the extremities of experience. Prisoners spoke of vanished comrades swept away by unseen forces, their fates known only in whispered conjecture. Some claimed the machine itself consumed bodies, converting them into fuel, data, or instruments of punishment. Others believed that the complex existed as a fragment of the Emperor's scrutiny, a testing ground where endurance and obedience were measured as rigorously as the production of promethium or munitions. Truth was impossible to discern, and yet the uncertainty was itself a weapon, pressing minds to the edge of comprehension, forcing adaptation through fear and speculation. Those who survived at the margins became masters of perception. Every corridor bend, every rhythmic hiss of machinery, every glance from a servitor's ocular sensors was a signal. They learned to predict the movements of enforcers, to anticipate inspections, and to exploit brief lapses in attention. Survival became a series of calculated risks, balancing the demands of labor with the opportunities hidden in shadow, rumor, and momentary distraction. In these margins, prisoners discovered the tenuous line between submission and defiance, obedience and agency, endurance and the very brink of annihilation. Pain was constant, yet its presence was normalized. Muscle fatigue, raw blisters, lacerations, and burns were part of daily reality, endured with grim determination. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, sleep remained a rare commodity, and punishment, whether inflicted by overseers, servitors, or the prison's own machinery, was unavoidable. Yet the most insidious torment was the erosion of certainty. Every rule could change without notice, every ally could betray, and every rumor carried both promise and peril. Life at the edge of oblivion was a calculus of observation, intuition, and emotional suppression, a perpetual negotiation between despair and survival. In whispered corners, prisoners debated the larger purpose of the penal complex. Some claimed it was merely a tool of the Imperium, designed to refine obedience and extract labor. Others suggested darker possibilities, the prison as a crucible for experimentation, a crucible for human will, a fragment of some secret, incomprehensible design by higher powers. These discussions were never safe, and yet they persisted, not for hope of action, but as a means of mental preservation. To speculate was to resist invisibly, to assert cognition where the body could be crushed and the spirit tested. Amid this relentless trial, networks of trust, however fragile, remained essential. Prisoners shared information, traded rations, and coordinated movements to evade attention. Bonds formed not out of camaraderie, but necessity, constantly tested by betrayal and shifting priorities. In these alliances, subtle hierarchies emerged. Those with perception, cunning, or endurance became leaders, guiding their peers through both labor and danger. Yet leadership was always conditional, a fragile arrangement dependent on observation, discretion, and the ability to remain unseen by the overseers. As the edge of oblivion pressed closer, prisoners began to reconcile with the duality of their existence. The prison was simultaneously a crucible of suffering and a space where skill, perception, and subtle agency could emerge. Each day tested both body and mind, yet each calculated success, a ration secured, a task completed without punishment, a secret successfully transmitted, became proof that the human will could endure. Even as machinery ground and overseers watched, those who survived discovered that the capacity to navigate terror and uncertainty was itself a form of mastery. The universe beyond the walls remained vast, aye,